If someone were to ask you to summarize the entire Bible in one sentence, could you do it? I think probably for most of us, it would be really hard to come up with one concise sentence that fully encapsulates the entire story of the Bible. But the fact is that there is one main story of the Bible, and it begins in Genesis. This is where it all starts. In Genesis, we get to meet God. He created everything, and we meet the one creation that God wants a unique relationship with. Us, human beings, people. We also meet the villain of the story, and this villain wants to undo all that God has created, and he does that by sowing seeds of doubt about God and his motives. Now, this villain is given many names throughout the Bible. We see the devil, Satan, deceiver, accuser, destroyer, just to name a few. He's a fallen angel whose mission is to turn the world against God. And the one thing that this villain wants to convince Adam and Eve of is this: you can't trust God. And he convinces them that they can take control by going against what God explicitly commanded them not to do. And they do it. And this introduces the concept of death, both physical and spiritual death. But this isn't just some tragic event that happened thousands of years ago. It affects you and me today. I mean, think about it this way. Because Adam and Eve disobeyed God, choosing to believe the lies of the villain, they invited pain. They invited chaos. They invited death into the world. God's perfect creation was cast into turmoil with Adam and Eve's choice to disobey. Their choice birthed in humanity a need to be rescued from sin and returned to a relationship with God. And this need is passed down to every single person. And so God, in his goodness and because of his love for us, immediately begins to initiate a rescue plan. And that plan is to send a human hero who is both fully God and fully man to ultimately crush this death curse. And this begins a chain reaction. We watch every human descendant constantly asking the question, is this the one? And in Genesis 11 and 12, we meet this man named Abraham, and we see a promise that God gives to him, that through Abraham, God would send this human hero so that we can start to focus on Abraham's descendants, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And this leads us to Exodus. Now, in Exodus, we see that over the next 400 years, Abraham's family grows into a nation of millions of people living in the land of Egypt. But they also suffer under oppressive slavery that has been forced on them by the Egyptian government. And they cry out to God for help, and he rescues them. And this begins the process of bringing them to a geographical location that he promised so that they could become a new nation. And so Israel is rescued. The people are delivered from slavery and poverty and returned to a place of security. They're given an identity. They're given a future, a hope. They're given an inheritance. And throughout history, God has chosen to be identified in this way. He is a God who rescues slaves from their bondage, and he claims them as his own. And so he wants this chosen family of Abraham to live in a way that would be set apart, to be different from the people of other nations. And so he gives them some instructions on how they can set up their society and rules or laws to live by. Leviticus and Deuteronomy contain these instructions and laws. These aren't just rules for the sake of having rules. They serve a much bigger purpose. You see, God wants Abraham's family, now known as the Israelites or the Hebrews, he wants them to be different, to be set apart, and to be attractive, to attract other nations who would wonder, why are they so different? In fact, we see in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 through 8, it says, "Look, I now teach you these decrees and regulations, just as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may obey them in the land you are about to enter and occupy. Obey them completely, and you will display your wisdom and intelligence among the surrounding nations. And when they hear all these decrees, they will exclaim, 'How wise and prudent are the people of this great nation.' For what great nation has a God as near to them as the Lord our God is near to us whenever we call on him? And what great nation has decrees and regulations as righteous and as fair as this body of instructions that I am giving you today? You see, these rules were intended to show God's people how to become a lighthouse in the world, so that other nations would see the truth of God and see who he is and his great love for them. And that in that process, they would be drawn away from the false gods that they worship, and they would be drawn towards belief in the one true God, the human rescuer that would deliver us from the curse of death. The problem was that if they didn't obey, and if the Israelites became like every other nation, the failure didn't just affect them. The failure had an impact on the entire world. And so God promises, hey, if you will obey, you will become a blessing to the entire world. But if you disobey, you're going to be punished. So the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy begin to cover the account of Abraham's descendants, making the move from Egypt to this geographical location that God had promised. And this leads us to the book of Joshua. Now, Joshua covers the miraculous military campaign that God led to establish the nation of Israel in this physical homeland that he had promised them. And so now they have this geographical place to set up this lighthouse and become an example of what it looks like for a nation to have a personal relationship with God and to enjoy that blessing and to draw other nations to the one true God. Unfortunately, as soon as they establish themselves, they begin to drift towards disobedience. They stop living by God's standards. And in doing so, they start to experience struggles and challenges just like God had promised. So they cry out to God, asking him to deliver them from the consequences of their disobedience. In the 7th book of the Bible, Judges, we see that God raises up these national heroes, 12 men and women that we call judges. And these heroes deliver the nation from the condition of being oppressed or defeated by other nations. But Israel keeps drifting towards disobedience, which leads to suffering more consequences. And this cycle repeats itself over and over and over, with their actions becoming more and more evil and destructive. Now, ultimately, the nation asks God to raise up a king to govern them, like all of the other nations. And so God allows this, and we see this history unfold in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Sadly, almost all of these kings lead the nation further and further away from God. And so we see Israel, whether on their own or being led by a king, constantly drifting away from the laws and the standards that God had given them. Not only are they missing out on everything God wanted for them to have as a nation, they're also failing to be the lighthouse that he called them to be as a nation, a beacon of hope that the world desperately needed so that they could see the one true God and his rescue story. Now, during this time of the kings, we learn some key clues about the arrival of this human hero that God had promised who would rescue them. And one of the clues is that he would come from the family of David. Now, this is the same David that killed Goliath. And God promises David that one of his descendants will be the one, the rescuer, the deliverer, the hero. And so now we're looking for a descendant of Abraham that specifically comes from the line of David. During the time of the kings, God also sent emissaries or ambassadors that we call prophets. He sent these prophets to Israel to call the country back to a state of obedience. And so a large portion of the Old Testament contains accounts of these prophets being sent by God to warn the nation that if they remain in this state of disobedience, they will suffer more and more consequences. And it can be frustrating reading the prophets because we know Israel isn't just missing out on a national blessing. They're missing out on the opportunity to do what they were supposed to do for the rest of the world. Their failure isn't just their own. It also prevents them from being a lighthouse to the rest of the world. And unfortunately, God cannot allow that. So because Israel refuses to turn back to God, who loves them and rescued them out of slavery. He allows the nation to experience a more severe judgment. Other nations begin to invade. The capital is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. And the people are exiled into foreign nations. And then about 70 years after the final group is exiled, a couple of groups begin to move back to Israel to reestablish its identity and its dignity. The first group we see is in the book of Ezra. They move back to reestablish the temple. And then we see a second group in Nehemiah. Now they go back to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and reestablish the capital city. There are other accounts in the Old Testament of individual faith journeys, Ruth and Esther and Job. And there are books of Hebrew poetry and wisdom, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Lamentation. And then in the very last book of the Old Testament, which is also the last book written in that time, Malachi, who was one of the prophets, he was warning the nation and calling them back to obedience. In the book of Malachi, we see a couple of key moments. Now, one is that God reaffirms that his plan is still going to happen. And the other is a strange clue right at the end of the book. Before the one, the rescuer that you all are waiting for, before the one can come, you should anticipate Elijah coming. Now, this is so strange because Elijah, who was a very powerful prophet in his own right, had died long before Malachi was ever written. And so we're left wondering, what's going to happen here? Is Elijah, who's been dead for a long time, is he coming back to life? Is that our sign that the rescuer is coming? And as we're left wondering that, the Old Testament ends and God is silent for 400 years.